In the next series of videos, I'm going to show you how I made a raccoon Bluetooth speaker carving. It's going to be in multiple videos because I separated it into gluing up the block to make the raccoon, carving the raccoon, and then making the Bluetooth player, which is essentially a replica boombox. As of filming this, what you're seeing in the screen, the raccoon and the boombox are not completely done. And admittedly, this first video, while it's probably the most important, will not be the most interesting, and that is going to be the process I'm using to glue up the block of plywood that I'm carving this out of. Now, some people do not like plywood, so I did a couple clips of a very similar process I did quite a few years ago for someone else. This was a Mandalorian Bluetooth speaker, but this time I used about 3/4 inch square pieces of multiple hardwoods. It gives you a very different look, but also possible. So if you want to do something like this and use the next series of videos to do it, you can glue up a block that's not plywood. But for my purposes, I decided to use plywood. I've carved plywood before. It could be a little bit difficult because the grain runs in such different patterns, but so can all other woods that you carve into. I had plenty of it, so it would be an inexpensive way to get the look I wanted because hardwood adds up really quickly, and the block I carved this out of was quite large. It was like 16 by 13 by 13. So in order to start this process, because my goal was to essentially pixelate the plywood as much as possible. So people might be familiar, quite a few years ago, photo mosaic photos were very popular. They were basically photos of multiple photos that created an entire image. Here's an example of what it looks like, and that was kind of what I was going with for the plywood. So I decided to glue it up in a chaos pattern like you would a cutting board. I've glued together and carved plywood before, and it can give you really cool patterns. Sometimes it looks like a 3D topographical map because as you cut around the surface and create different planes, it kind of gives you layers. That look is neat for if that's what you're going for, but I didn't want the plywood pattern to break up the pattern of the actual raccoon. And that's another reason why I chose not to do the Mandalorian style. It doesn't show up super well in photos, but in real life I thought the big blocks of different color kind of broke up the object as a whole. So my goal is to break down the grain of this plywood as much as possible, so it will still give me a cool pattern, and once it's clear coated it should look pretty neat, but it won't be a distraction to the actual carving of the raccoon. So all I did this first time around, this is going to be multiple glue ups because like I said, I'm building this similarly to how you would a chaos cutting board, is I had 1/4 inch ply, 1/2 inch ply, 3/4 inch ply, and I just laid it out so it rotated 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4, and that was going to be kind of the beginning. They're all different species too, which will help. And that will kind of be the beginning of breaking up this ply. And then I'm making them small enough so I could send them to the planer. I have an old set of blades in there, so I'm not messing up my blades with all the glue, and it's just going to make fast work because there's multiple glue ups to this process. Now, because this isn't a cutting board, this is a carving, and it's for fun in my shop, I wasn't super concerned with this being perfect, but I wanted it to be accurate. This was a long-term project in the shop. The first video clip I did of this was back in August, so I've been working on it on and off for a while. So then once again, just like cutting boards, I'm going to take all of my blocks and I'm going to break them up into segments. So roughly the thickness of my original ply was about 1.5, and the segments I'm breaking it up into are also about 1.5. You can see all of my boards, and then at this point I'm going to cherry pick pieces from each pile and start mixing them up again. And it's a little hard to see because even though plywood's made of different species, it kind of is essentially the same sort of color, but you can see all of the species now are getting mixed up again. And then I could make a straight edge of all of this and then glue these together once again. So it's basically just a series of gluing them up in different patterns to get the look I'm going for. So I could lay these out, add glue, turn them back over, and at this point they were a little bit taller because I knew I kind of wanted to have part of the arms that you saw in the beginning clip as part of the base. I was going to have to attach arms, but I wanted there to be a solid foundation connected to the base. So like I said, the height of this was about 16 inches. So my final ones were small enough to fit in the planer, so about 13 inches wide by about 16 inches tall, and I started gluing them up into multiple pieces. Then once again can send them through the planer. Now the next process is how I'm going to create the chaos pattern. It's a pretty simple process. You basically just cut the way I did before, but you're starting with an angled piece. Now I've never done a chaos pattern before, so you could see the first angle I cut off was a little too small. I just adjusted the angle on my crosscut sled, and then I could keep going. So on all of my pieces I'm cutting off an angle, and this angle could really, it varies, but I went with about 6 to 7 degrees. So I have that first angled piece, and then when I go back through and cut the rest, they'll line up with that fence I have on the table saw sled, and I could cut all of them. So the first process was cutting that initial angle. Now you could see it's tilted because that angle is riding against the wooden piece I have on the side. And then just so that it doesn't kick on me, I'm just using a slatted piece of wood on the end so that it all stays in place. And then each of these I could run through and once again cut them into slats. Now with a chaos pattern, you could do this as many times as you want and really make it as chaotic as possible. For myself, I did this, I didn't film all of them. I think I did it 2, potentially 3 times. And then at that point, you could see it's a lot of work. I wanted it to have that pixelated look, but I also wasn't going to cut this all up a million times. It also uses quite a bit of glue doing it every time. And then this is what it's starting to look like. So you could see now all of those horizontals are now starting to get broken up, so they're not going to be as much of a pattern. And when you have that break in a visual is when your eye kind of meshes everything together, and that will give me that kind of photo mosaic look I'm looking for. So then I glued those together, and once again, this is the second time doing it. It's the exact same process. You could see I'm flipping them again, and it's getting even more chaotic. And like I said, I might have stopped at 2 or done 3. I honestly can't remember, but it's really up to your visual kind of sensibilities, how far you want to take it. You can see just like cutting boards, I'm flipping every other one, and then I could glue them together. And once again, you could see every time I do this, the pattern gets more and more chaotic. It's also going to give me some really interesting angles, which kind of show up neatly in the final carving as well. And then that is what my final blocks look like. Now at this point, I'd kind of decided on a size, which is funny because now that it's almost done, it is bigger than I would have wanted it to be, but that's kind of par for the course with how I make things. But this is the basic block, and then the pieces that are left over I use for the arms and other parts of that raccoon. I also have some left over, which is nice, and then I could glue this block up into one big piece. And that is essentially how that's made. So like I said, it's not the most interesting process probably to watch, but it was really important to do this because the carving itself, visually speaking, what the actual object looks like is pretty much exactly what I was hoping for. So then at this point, now everyone knows the raccoon is holding a speaker. And the nice thing about the internet is I had decided what I wanted to make because I wanted a Bluetooth speaker. I have earbuds, but they get on my nerves sometimes. I really wanted a speaker in the shop. And luckily, luck would have it, you go online and search raccoon holding up speaker, and there were images on there, which I used to get the proportions. And then the next video is going to be carving that whole thing, but you can see as I started cutting into this how I have really interesting arcs and patterns going throughout the whole thing because of that chaos pattern.